Hello, everyone, and welcome to this evening's Nutshell discussion. Thank you so much for joining us. If this is your first Nutshell, welcome, and if you're joining us again, welcome back. My name is Katie Adams, and I am the Research and Demonstration Farm Manager here at the Savanna Institute, and I will be your host tonight. Before we get started, I'd love to share a little bit about who we are and what we do. The Savanna Institute is a nonprofit organization based out of Wisconsin and Illinois, focused on agroforestry research and education. We truly believe that widespread agroforestry can help restore ecosystems, build resilience, and support strong economies of cooperation between farmers, researchers, and perennial industry builders. We do this work through a variety of avenues, such as the nutshells that we're all enjoying tonight. But we also offer on-farm field days to learn from farmers on the ground. We offer print and online resources for free on our website, focused on agroforestry practice, land access, and lease structures. We're currently building a network of demonstration farms across central Illinois and southern Wisconsin, and we're excited to have our first crop of agroforestry apprentices on the line tonight and with us this year in the field. The Savanna Institute also hosts the Perennial Farm Gathering each December. This event will be at the Sinsinawa Mound Center near Dubuque, Iowa on December 6th and 7th, and we'd love to have you join us at this phenomenal event. I'd like to thank our sponsors, the Heckner Family Foundation and North Central SARE. Without their support, we wouldn't be able to bring you these awesome discussions for free. During this evening's nutshell, if you're joining us from a computer, I want to invite all of you to share your questions and comments on the chat box on free conference call here. I will monitor them throughout the nutshell, and I'll make sure to address every question dropped in there during the Q&A session at the end. If you're joining us by phone, I'll give you instructions on how to ask a question after Gary's presentation has ended. So let's move on to the main event. We are so honored to welcome our presenter for the evening, Gary Bentrup with the USDA National Agroforestry Center based out of Lincoln, Nebraska. Gary is a U.S. Forest Service Research Landscape Planner at the USDA National Agroforestry Center. His work focuses on developing resources for designing multi-functional agroforestry practices. I'm really excited to learn from Gary tonight. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. Give us one moment while we switch presenters.
Good evening. Can everyone hear me?
Hi, Gary. You're coming in loud and clear.
Great, great. Well, thanks, Katie, for that introduction, and thanks, everybody, for joining us this evening. And while I maximize my screen, there we go. Really pleased to talk tonight about how agroforestry can play a role in promoting pollinators. And this work, I've been working with the Xerces Society for a couple of years now on this topic, and I think there's some really intriguing opportunities. And so we'll go ahead and start moving into the presentation. And most of you know, obviously, the important role that pollinators play. If we're interested in food, we're very interested in pollinators. Over 30% of our food relies on insect pollinators. So as I was kind of that, sorry, slide looks a little different. Okay. That really, pollinators play an important role also in food security because most of our vitamins come from insect-pollinated plants. And so they play a key role. And next slide. Or I assume you have to advance it. Correct, Katie? All right. Pardon for the little shifting in text, but I want to key off of Katie's talk from last week, where she was talking about key tree crops of the Midwest. And this table is kind of draft. I just put it together very quickly. But we looked at those species that Katie presented and which ones require insect pollination. And there's two on there that are really pretty specifically wind pollinated. But the rest of them, there is indication that they do benefit from insect pollination. And the crop impact from pollinators is significant on a few of these. We know that for sure for apples, Asian pear, also honey bear. Some of the other species we're a little uncertain. There's a lot of missing information regarding pollination ecology right now. But the important thing to note is, in terms of value to pollinators, these tree and shrub species play a large role for insect pollinators in particular by providing pollen and nectar as well as larval resources for butterflies and moths. Next slide. So we're also interested in pollinators because they play a very keystone role in ecosystems. Over 75% of our flowering plants in temperate regions require animal pollination. And so they really are a key in the food web. Pollinators and insects are food sources for over 89% of birds and many other wildlife species. Next slide. So let's kind of meet the pollinators, and this will be a brief introduction. Of course, we're familiar with bees, and most of us are probably most familiar with honeybees, and they do provide a lot of our food pollination services. But other bees, such as the bumblebees, mason bees, many other solitary bees, also provide important pollination services, particularly for crops. Other pollinators that we don't always think about are flies, and they do play an important role in probably more maintaining ecosystem services and natural diversity of landscapes. We also have butterflies and moths. There are also pollen beetles that collect pollen and use it as a food source. And then last but not least are bats and hummingbirds. And bats particularly are in the U.S. Pollinating cactus in the desert southwest, and hummingbirds are kind of throughout the United States pollinating many flowers that have tubular type floral structures. Next slide, please. So we know really pollinators are facing many threats from a variety of fronts. There was a recent report that over 40% of our invertebrate pollinators may be risked to extinction, although there's really a lack of good monitoring on insect pollinator populations. But some of the threats that are facing pollinators are pesticides from a variety of sources, both urban and agriculture, habitat loss, breaking up that natural landscape and that fragmentation, and then also native or non-native species and diseases that are associated with them have also had an impact on pollinators. And last but not least, climate change is also throwing a wrench into the works where we're starting to get plant phenology coming at different times and not always sequencing with pollinator activity or being subject to, for instance, early frost when they're flowering, and then losing that floral resource for pollinators. Next slide, please. So agroforestry, by its nature, again, apologize for some of the text issues, but agroforestry adds structural and functional diversity on the landscape. And so by its very nature, it should have an impact on pollinators. But we really haven't taken a hard look at how agroforestry is going to really play a role in pollinator conservation. And so with my partners from the Xerces Society a couple years ago, we decided to do a really in-depth research synthesis on the literature that's out there and kind of try to pull together that knowledge and start to prepare kind of guidelines for practitioners who want to improve designing of agroforestry practices to benefit pollinators. And what this review revealed, we reviewed over 134 papers, and most of the papers were really focused on windbreaks, riparian buffers, hedgerows. There was very limited research done specifically on silvopasture systems or forest farming. However, the information that kind of came out of this really is applicable across agroforestry practices in terms of tree species and shrub species that particularly add value to that site connectivity and landscape connectivity that I'll talk about in a little bit. Next slide. And this table is not anything to really dwell on, but it's just to show the range of papers that we looked at when we looked at this topic and the different types of ways that agroforestry practices have been shown to have an effect on pollinators. And so we tried to take this information and distill it down, and we have both a book chapter and a synthesis paper, hopefully that will be coming out later this year. But I'll move into next slide, which will start to talk about the specifics that we learned from this synthesis. And so there's kind of what we found is there's three key benefits that agroforestry provides to pollinators. Agroforestry practices can provide foraging resources and nesting sites or egg-laying sites for pollinators. There's also, it enhances site and landscape connectivity. And if appropriately designed and managed, it can reduce pesticide exposure. Next slide, please. So some of the key foraging habitat benefits are a lot of tree and shrub species provide quality pollen and nectar. There's a high density of resources found in agroforestry practices. There is also a variety of a diversity of floral resources often to be found with tree-based practices. And there is also a real benefit in the range of bloom times that can be found in tree and shrub species. And then regarding butterflies and moths, tree and shrub species can really be important larval resources for these species for caterpillars. Next slide, please. So regarding quality pollen and nectar, shrub and tree species do vary significantly in their value to pollinators. And both insect pollinators, again, rely on nectar and pollen. They rely on nectar for a food source, for energy, and the pollen is used to provision a nest for the young. And so some species provide a good balance of nectar and pollen, and other species kind of provide more benefits in terms of either pollen or nectar. Here's just kind of a list of some of the species that particularly have good nectar and pollen resources. And these include maples, serviceberry, which again is one of the tree crops we talked about last week. The cherry family, there's often really good nectar and pollen resources in both of these. Oaks don't really provide any benefit in terms of nectar, but do have high quality pollen, which is a very rich in amino acids and other nutrients for healthy bumblebee pollinators in particular. Brambles, and then one of my favorite are willows, have a very high density of nectar and pollen resources, and elderberry as well. The lower species are herbaceous species, just to kind of provide context for these numbers. These numbers were kind of based off of honeybee data, but are applicable to wild bees as well. And it's kind of on a scale from 0, which means no pollen or nectar resource, to 1 being a major pollen or nectar resource. Next slide, please. This is one that I really am pretty excited about. I think it's a really important value that agroforestry can provide. And it's the fact that when we use flowering trees and shrubs in agroforestry practices, particularly if we're combining them with also herbaceous flowering plants. We get much more pollen and nectar resources per unit of area than if we just had a herbaceous planting. And so the bottom diagram kind of illustrates this conceptually, that when we're talking with a multi-story system like agroforestry, we have a volume that we can work with, and that it can provide significantly higher pollen and nectar resources. So one study showed that 2 to 4 times greater nectar per unit area in hedgerows compared to woodlands or pasture. In the table above, these are European species, a willow and a hawthorn and a couple herbaceous species. But it shows that, you know, the flowers per meter squared can be significantly higher in like species such as a hawthorn or willow, and that nectar productivity can be really high relative to some herbaceous species. So I think this is a real exciting opportunity. Next slide, please. So again, sorry on the text, but we'll work through this quickly. So one of the beauties also of tree and shrub species is that they have a variety of floral types. And pollinators require, the diversity of pollinators require different types of flower resources. So for instance, a hawksbill moth wants long tubular flowers like the bottlebrush, whereas other solitary bees really can take advantage of maple flowers. And then carpenter bees can take advantage of hawthorn flowers. And also with moth and butterflies, that if we want to really promote a rich abundance and diversity of pollinators, a rich abundance of flower, tree and shrub species will help us in that quest. Next slide, please. One of the other benefits with tree and shrub species that are used in agroforestry practices is that within temperate regions, many of our flowering tree and shrub species are early flowering. They'll flower in March, April, May, into June. And this is a particularly important time period because herbaceous plants are usually not flowering as much at this point in time. They're usually mid to late summer. And so these tree and shrub species play a key role in providing flower and nectar resources early in the season to help get pollinator populations off to a good start. And we can take a look here at some of the different species and kind of their time frame when they're flowering. And so again, maples, willows, serviceberries, black cherry, blueberry are some great ones for that early season. We move into later, sumac, chokecherry, aronia, and hawthorn, and elderberry can be important later in the season. What is important to note is as we get later in the season, there's not so many flowering tree and shrub species. And so it's important that if we really want to provide good pollinator resources over that course of the full season, we also need to not ignore the herbaceous plants, particularly late blooming ones like asters that will help provide that late season bloom. Next slide, please. I pulled this slide, or these graphs, from a paper that was done, or a study done in Michigan, just to kind of illustrate that point on the important role that these early flowering woody species play. And so the diagram on the right, and again, well, you can see the green color is maple species, the red is your cherry and plum species, and your yellow is willow. And so early in April and May, for wild solitary bees, a significant portion of their pollen resources were collected from these species. Over the course of the season, it changed, but also rubus species and sumac were also important species. And the same is true for wild social bees, both bumblebees and humblebees. And in this case, willows were really key in supporting them. So just to kind of illustrate that important role that tree and shrub pollen plays for pollinators. Next slide, please. Been talking mostly from the benefit of these tree species from a bee's perspective. However, tree and shrub species also play a very important role for your butterfly and moth species. And they're often larval resources for these species. And one study found, more in the mid-Atlantic part of the U.S., that woody species were found to support 10 times more butterfly and moth species than herbaceous species. In this case, some of those species or families that were really key for providing these larval resources for butterflies included oaks, cherry plum, willow, birch, poplar, crabapple, maple, and so forth. And so, again, if an agroforestry practice has these species within them, they'll be providing also great larval resources for butterflies. Another point is that they also, tree and shrub species, provide good overwintering sites for butterflies. They often will overwinter under bark or in the leaf duff at the base of trees. Next slide, please. I'd like to also mention another resource that bees collect from woody plant species. And they collect resins and oils from tree buds. And for honeybees, they collect these resins to make what's called propolis, which has antimicrobial properties. And they use this in the hive to seal up holes in the hive. And it also helps protect the hive and acts as kind of a barrier to pests and diseases. Popular trees, the populous species, are a really common source for these resins. But other species do include pine, birch, elm, alder, beech, and horse chestnut. And other bees besides honeybees do use resins for other provisioning services. Next slide, please. One of the things that agroforestry practices can also do is they can modify the microclimate, which can have an effect on pollinators and their foraging activities. So we know windbreaks provide downwind, a protected zone, often 10 to 15 times the height, for services such as soil erosion and microclimate effects. It shows up that this is also a protected zone for pollinator activity. And so there is usually 3 times more pollinator insects in that zone as well. And honeybees in particular will start to shut down their foraging activity when winds get too high. And so windbreaks or any type of practice that slows down the wind around a crop that needs pollination will benefit pollinator activity. Daytime air temperatures are also several times warmer downwind of windbreaks. And when you have vegetable or fruit crops that are often pollinating at times of year that might be on the cooler side, those several degrees warmer will actually increase pollinator activity as well. So that can play an important role. When we're talking about managed honeybee hives, there's been studies to show that when you protect these hives with windbreaks, the overwintering populations can be up to 52% higher when they're protected by windbreaks. So that can be an important role, particularly if one's in a cool, harsh climate that managed honeybees need to be protected. Next slide, please. Moving on to nesting. And so 30% of our native bees build their nests in hollow tunnels. These tunnels are often found in stems of woody plants that have soft, pithy centers. And some of these species include elderberry, box elder, brambles, dogwood, and sumac. So one can increase nesting activity of these bee species by just even kind of pruning them to expose the pithy interior of the stems. Also to retaining dead or dying trees or branches where practical in an agroforestry practice will also provide opportunities for these tunnel nesting species. Next slide, please. The majority of our bee species, though, are what we call solitary ground nesting species. And they actually dig tunnels in undisturbed ground for nesting. And most of these are found in kind of turf, often in kind of bare or exposed ground. Often in sandy to loamy soils is the type of soil that they prefer. But the important thing here is, and studies have shown, where you don't have tillage, it really helps provide nesting areas for these bee species. Because where you have annual tillage, you destroy the tunnels and they don't have successful nesting. So the agroforestry component that provides that undisturbed soil base can be important for these ground nesting species. Another group of bee species that are particularly important actually for pollination of crops is bumblebees. And they're social bees. They form small colonies and they nest in cavities such as abandoned rodent burrows, right at the duff layer of trees. And studies have shown here that bumblebee nest densities are often twice as high along linear wood habitats like hedgerows and shelter belts than even in woodland itself or in pasture land or cropland. So again, it looks like we can provide some good nesting habitat for these ground nesting species. Next slide. Moving on to connectivity. And bees have different foraging distances, and it's often kind of tied to their size. So small little bees have a limited foraging distance, around 150 feet to 500 feet. And these are important species for pollinating crops like melon, tomato, and pepper. Mason, sweat bees, and squash bees have a farther foraging distance, maybe about 1,000 to 2,500 feet. And these species are also important for pollinating crops like tomato, pepper as well, but also squash, peach, and pear. As we move up in size, we get into some plaster bees and mining bees. And these are important bees for crops like blueberry, apple, strawberry, and alfalfa. They have a much larger foraging distance, about 1,500 feet up to 3,500 feet. And then finally we have bumblebees, and they're kind of the bombers that can fly some distance across the landscapes. And they can go 1 to 1.5 miles, and they're important for crops like cranberry and squash and watermelon, sunflower, and many other crops. So when we think, next slide please, when we think about how agroforestry can play a role in this, we know that it can help provide connectivity. If these practices have good floral resources for pollinators, if they're planted with good tree and shrub species that pollinators benefit, they can provide habitat across that landscape. So as they moved out to forage, they have other places to come back to either nest or also get additional foraging resources. And we know that pollinator visits to crops really start to decline as you get away from kind of semi-natural habitat or kind of agroforestry type habitat. Next slide, please. So I think there's a real opportunity to think about how we can layer agroforestry practices and get multiple ecosystem services. So I'll walk through this kind of example here. And we often use windbreaks for, again, soil erosion, microclimate modification, aid in retention of soil moisture to get kind of yield benefits. But if we're also planting these species, these windbreaks with pollinator-friendly species, we're also going to benefit connectivity. And so if we do a windbreak, and using this example, say 40 feet in height, we're going to be spacing a windbreak around 400 to 600 feet across the field. Now that midpoint of the field is only about 200 to 300 feet from the windbreak. And that is well within the foraging distance of some of the smallest bee pollinators, their foraging distance. So sweat bees that are in that 150 to 450 feet range. And so they can easily move out from that habitat and aid in pollinating a crop. Another important point here is when we're thinking about other ecosystem services, other studies have shown that pest control from hedgerows often declines out about at 300 feet. So the closer you are to a hedgerow, the more biological pest control you will have in your crop. And so again, having these windbreaks that are pollinator friendly and biological and also other beneficial insect friendly, you're going to get these insect-based services. And at the bottom, when we think about, say, a 10-acre field with a 15H windbreak and a windbreak that's around 40 to 50 feet, the windbreak area as a percentage of that field is around 12 to 15% of the area. Now, some will see that as out of crop production. But when we look at it holistically, we know that windbreak is offering a lot of value. We could be also harvesting products from it, but it aids us into benefiting pollinators. Next slide. And this is where the research gets less definitive. We don't have a lot of good information out there on how much agroforestry area we need or how much kind of natural habitat we need next to crop fields to have full pollination services, particularly from wild bees, but even honeybees. And we know from kind of this one study where the chart shows as we get a percent of natural habitat, as we move out that 10 to 30%, we start to really get increased flower visitation frequency. Another study looked at that when 30% of the land within about a 1.2 kilometer area of field is in pollinator habitat, you'll have full pollination of watermelon. Now, our previous example showed that with that windbreak, we have around 12 to 15%. So maybe we might not get full pollination service, but we're getting in that direction, and we're also going to be getting other ecosystem service benefits like yield increase or a microclimate yield increase. Next slide. Now I'd like to move into pesticide exposure, and this is a real concern for a lot of organic producers, as well as many agroforestry producers who are concerned about pesticides in general. And for pollinators, there's so many numerous pathways that pollinators can be exposed to pesticides. There's obviously the direct contact from applications and spray drift. It can also contaminate nesting materials or floral resources. It can run off the land through dissolved runoff and get into pools of water where the pollinators will get water and can get exposure that way. So there's numerous pathways, and one of the particular concerns for or pesticide concerns these days for pollinators is the increase in neonicotinoids, and the one chart kind of shows that increased use of neonicotinoids in many of our crops. And so we wanted to take a look at what are the ways that agroforestry practices can maybe help mitigate pesticide exposure. Next slide. However, as we were doing this, we did come across some evidence and research that also pointed to a potential problem with agroforestry practices or practices that are using flowering tree and shrub species. So there was higher concentrations of neonicotinoids have been found in early flowering tree and shrub pollen, primarily through during planting time when the neonicotinoid coating on seeds, particularly corn, is drifting off and collecting on adjacent floral resources. And since these are the floral resources flowering at the time, and these are where the bees are collecting resources, there is concern that they could provide a sink for these pesticides and increase exposure risk, something we're obviously not wanting. So when we're thinking about that, there's some ways around how to kind of mitigate this. Next slide. One of the ways, we actually have some research going on here at the University of Nebraska where we're looking at the use of woody buffers, basically using non-pollinator friendly plants to try to reduce seed, both spray drift and seed drift, and protect pollinator habitat from being exposed from these pesticides. And so it's still kind of ongoing research, but we know if we look at trying to kind of protect our pollinator plantings, particularly the ones with floral resources, we should be benefiting pollinators. And I have some kind of general recommendations regarding that on the next slide. So when we're looking at pesticide barrier recommendations, so there's two ways, again, that two main ways that pesticides can come off the landscape and be influenced by an agroforestry practice. So we have on the left spray drift barriers, and this can be thought of as like windbreaks. And studies have shown that these woody plantings can reduce pesticide spray drift by up to 80 to 90%. So they can be very effective. And this is great if, say, you're trying to protect your operation from pesticide drift coming from a neighboring farm that is applying pesticides. And so some of the recommendations in terms of providing a good barrier is the planting should at least be around 8 to 10 feet tall or greater than 2 times the height of the crop height. You want to shoot for about a 40 to 50% porosity, and fine evergreen foliage is particularly effective for this. Also, plants with hairy or resinous or coarse surface leaves also really are good at filtering out pesticides that are being transported via the wind. Again, want to look at probably using plant species that are generally unfriendly to pollinators if you're really trying to use it as a spray drift barrier, and this would include most of your conifers. Now, when we think about the pesticides that are coming in runoff, we know that from kind of studies that they can be about 40 to 100% effective in reducing pesticides in runoff. It kind of depends on the type of pesticides that are in the runoff. But a couple key considerations here, and usually we're thinking of, say, riparian buffers, is that we want a good dense understory vegetation, ideally thick grass, to really serve as that filter for that runoff. We want an overstory canopy with plant species that have relatively low shade density so that you maintain that good understory vegetation. And then also having diverse plantings with variable rooting depths to help create a rhizosphere that will help break down those pesticides in this rooting zone are some of the key kind of considerations for trying to reduce pesticide exposure from runoff. Next slide. And one kind of final possible recommendation, and this is again if one is the applicator themselves or if you have a neighbor that you can work with in terms of encouraging a no-spray buffer zone. And so studies have looked at if we just provide a no-spray buffer zone within the crop and still using a, say, barrier to prevent it from going any further. And so spray drift deposition in one study of hedgerows showed that it was reduced by 72% when a 40-foot no-spray buffer zone was used. And so just even not spraying within the field can be really helpful in preventing that from going into, say, any pollinator habitat that one might have. And the chart on the right just shows kind of a summary of some of the different no-spray drift buffer zones that have been recommended based on the research literature and based on application type. However, a lot of this is really dependent on the specific pesticide. Next slide. And I'd like to finish up with just at least one call out on silvopasture. And there, we were not able to really find any good evidence on silvopasture and pollinators to make any really good recommendations. But I do want to pull out this study that was done in the southeast United States. And it looked at the number of bees and the number of species in 7 different types of forest conditions. And it might be a little blurry on the right, but we can see that dense pine and bottomland hardwoods had very low numbers of bees as well as bee species richness. As we move to the farther right side of that chart, we see that mature pine and grass, clear cut, were some of the forest types that had the greatest number of species. And when we think about how we try to manage silvopasture, it really is kind of more in that mature pine grass, especially if we have good diverse forbs also with that. And so we think probably silvopasture is very compatible with pollinators. There probably is timing issues in terms of having the cows graze rotational to try to protect some of those floral resources so that they're out there for pollinators when they need them. But it just did point that we do need more research regarding silvopasture and pollinators. Next slide, please. Now I would like to just kind of wrap it up with providing a couple places where there's some really great resources out there. As I mentioned, the Xerces Society which works on invertebrate conservation, and they have tremendous resources on invertebrate conservation in general, but pollinator resources. And this is just a sampling of their resources. Most of these, about everything, is free for download from their website. I'd like to call out a special thanks to some of my Xerces colleagues on this, Jennifer Hopwood, Nancy Lee Edmondson, and Mace Vaughn. Next slide. A couple key resources that they have are hedgerow planting guides for different areas in the United States, kind of based on states. So with plant recommendations on what are good species. They have other planting guide information that can be found on their website. I also want to call out this excellent book that's available for download for free, Farming for Bees, Guidelines for Providing Native Bee Habitat on Farms. Next slide, please. And here is a few kind of resources from the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And they have, such as this one, on pollinator-friendly trees for Texas and Louisiana, as well as plant resource guides for the Northwest, as well as some excellent resources on how to reduce pesticide exposure. The best way to find these resources is to do a search using NRCS and pollinators. Next slide, please. And then I'd like to finish up with just a few resources that we have at the National Agroforestry Center. We have different information sheets, working tree brochures, as well as agroforestry notes on providing nesting sites, floral resources, as well as using agroforestry practices to reduce pesticide risk. We also have the Conservation Buffer Guideline, which provides illustrated guidelines for designing kind of linear agroforestry practices for multiple ecosystem services. And all these resources are available free from our website. And if you have, we'll open it up to questions, but if you have any questions after the webinar that you want to reach out to, there's my email, and look forward to talking with you. And that's the end of the presentation.
Thank you so much for that, Gary. I learned so much, and I'm glad that we share a love of willow trees, because it's a tree that I am also very excited about for many reasons. And it is a tree that you can grow for cash cropping as well. It has beautiful basket qualities as well as craft qualities. Well, we have a question from Avery, who was asking earlier in the presentation, is the quality of the pollen and nectar in the tree list based upon proportion of honeybee diet, quantity produced by that plant species, nutrient density of that pollen or nectar?
Good question. So regarding the nectar, it was, in fact, both of them actually really were just on quantity. So overall, like the nectar, just how many milligrams of sugar per flower was what it was based on. And then the pollen as well in that particular chart. Now, in the synthesis work that we did identify some species, for instance, horse chestnut, see if I can even pull up some of the species that actually have been identified to have particularly not just the quantity, but high quality that had good amino acids and other sterols for pollinator. There's been some neat research on bumblebees in particular and pollen quality and what kind of woody species that provide that. But like I said, hopefully we'll have that paper out in maybe another month or two. And I can get more of a list if a follow-up on that.
I have a follow-up question related to that. Has there been any studies, or do you know of any differences between natives and cultivated varieties of certain trees in terms of nectar and pollen?
That's a great question. There's been a little bit of research looking at some of the horticulture varieties that have been developed, and so whether they provide the same level of value to pollinators. So say a mock orange that's been a cultivar that was maybe made to have a double floral arrangement for kind of aesthetics. Does that have the same value as, say, more of a native mock orange or something like that? And right now, it does seem, as a general rule of thumb, the more native species that don't have kind of, have not been bred for more of a aesthetic floral, something different than what the plant originally had, the native is better. Now, whether a cultivar that's been, say, more for bred for, say, a crop improvement, let's say a native apple versus a more of a, well, versus maybe one more a cultivar, I have not seen anything that has distinguished that. So I think, you know, it's more if it has changed the floral structure.
Okay. Well, Gary, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I know that I am going to take all this information into my work with the Savanna Institute, and I hope everyone joining us on the line will put things into practice right away. And much gratitude also for sharing this bounty of resources with us. As a follow-up to this nutshell presentation, I will be sending out an email with the evaluation as well as this presentation here, which I'll make sure it's formatted correctly, as well as a link to the YouTube video that we'll edit and throw up on the internet here in a couple days. Gary, thank you so much once again, and thank you for all the work that you're doing at the National Agroforestry Center for Pollinators and Agroforestry.
Thank you for letting us share it.
Okay, have a wonderful night, everyone, and I'll see you at the Perennial Farm Gathering December 5th and 6th at the Cincinnati Mountain Center. Have a wonderful evening, and go out and plant some wonderful pollinating crops today.